Stephanie Lazarus was born on December 12, 1959 in Simi Valley, California. She enrolled at the University of California in the fall of 1978, majoring in political science and sociology. She was placed in Dykstra Hall dorm as a freshman, where she met a man named John Rutten, a mechanical engineering student. Both Lazarus and Rutten were competitive athletes. Lazarus earned a spot on UCLA's junior varsity women's basketball team, where she was known as an aggressive and tenacious player. The two became friends during their freshman year and spent increasing amounts of time together as their college years progressed. Their friends noticed even then that Lazarus seemed to attach more emotional significance to the friendship than Rutten did. He would later describe their dynamic as nothing more than fooling around. She, meanwhile, told friends and classmates that Rutten was her boyfriend. She described him as her college boyfriend to people she met during her early years in law enforcement, and she attended his company's 1983 Christmas party as his date, where they had a photograph taken together. Specific behaviors Lazarus exhibited during their time at UCLA pointed toward an attachment style that was, at minimum, controlling. She stole Rutten's clothes when he went to shower in the dorm bathroom, leaving him to return to his room naked. She also took photos of him while he was asleep and only wearing underwear. Lazarus graduated from UCLA in 1982, where she considered law school given her political science background, but she ultimately chose law enforcement instead. At the time, the LAPD was actively recruiting women. A gender discrimination lawsuit filed by former female officers had resulted in a consent decree requiring the department to increase female representation on the force. Lazarus applied, was accepted, and completed a special 8-week pre-academy training program before entering formal training. During the academy, classmates remembered her for her intensity, particularly during physical combat training exercises that involved weapon retention, situations in which trainees had to fight to keep control of a firearm when an aggressor tried to take it away from them. She graduated from the academy and became a uniformed LAPD officer in 1983 and settled into a condo in Granada Hills and rented out the spare bedroom to a fellow officer. For her first assignment, Lazarus was assigned the Hollywood Division. Hollywood in the early 1980s was experiencing one of its most turbulent periods with high street crime, an illegal escort industry, and substance activity. But what damaged the department mainly was the Hollywood burglar scandal, where 14 officers were fired after 2 were prosecuted for burglarizing video stores while on duty during their patrol shifts. LAPD Chief Daryl Gates had personally overseen the internal affairs investigation that followed. In his later writings, he described Hollywood as generating higher rates of misconduct than virtually any other division in the department. Officers there upheld what is commonly called the blue wall of silence with particular intensity, regularly advising one another to operate by a simple code: admit nothing, deny everything, demand proof. Lazarus, ambitious and eager to gain acceptance within the ranks, accepted it. Entries from her diary show her increasingly self-identifying as an LAPD officer above almost all other aspects of her identity. She wrote about the process of becoming accepted by fellow officers, about developing the professional detachment to extreme violence without breaking down, and about projecting an attitude of nonchalance in situations that would shatter most people. While at Hollywood, she also encountered her first significant experience of workplace misconduct. Her training officer, James Tomer, repeatedly made advances toward her. He grew more and more outraged with each refusal, even going as far as spreading rumors through the division that she was a lesbian. Tomer later faced departmental charges of narcotics theft, and Lazarus was called to testify at his disciplinary hearing. He was acquitted and subsequently sued the LAPD in federal court, arguing the internal affairs proceeding had been a setup. He won, becoming the first person to successfully sue the department over an internal affairs investigation, though the verdict was later overturned on appeal. Lazarus had now early in her career experienced firsthand the frat-like nature in how the department operated and how someone could get themselves out of accountability. After 1 year of probationary patrol in Hollywood, she was transferred to the Devonshire Division in March 1985. Devonshire covered Northridge, Chatsworth, and Granada Hills, quieter residential neighborhoods with far lower crime rates and substantially better officer morale. As for her relationship with Rutten post-graduation from 1981 to 1984, the two began sleeping with each other. At this point, Rutten had found a job at Data Products, a computer peripherals manufacturer in the San Fernando Valley. They saw each other 2 or 3 times a month, occasionally traveling together. Rutten would later testify that they had slept together 20 to 30 times in total over that period, but that he never once considered her his girlfriend and had consistently dated other women throughout the same time. He regarded the arrangement as mutually casual, but Lazarus was still under the assumption that the two were in a serious relationship. She threw him a surprise 25th birthday party, unaware that he had been simultaneously seeing other women, including someone he had met at a party in June 1984. This woman was named Sherry Rasmussen, and she was born in 1957 in Walla Walla, Washington. Her family eventually moved to Arizona, where she spent the majority of her childhood and adolescent years. She entered college at 16, enrolling at La Sierra University. After her freshman year, she was accepted into Loma Linda University's nursing program and transferred to begin her formal medical education. After completing her undergraduate degree at Loma Linda, Sherry moved directly into the coronary care unit at UCLA Medical Center. While working full-time in critical care, she enrolled in UCLA's graduate nursing program and earned her master's degree in nursing in 1980. With her master's completed, she was promoted to head nurse of UCLA's coronary care and observation unit. By her late 20s, she had been recruited away from UCLA for a position as director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Her father, Nels, deeply proud, purchased a condo for Sherry in the gated Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles. Rutten and Sherry's relationship developed quickly. They jogged together and played tennis, and Sherry's friends stated that she seemed genuinely happy. When the two got engaged in 1985, Sherry received a BMW as a gift from Rutten. Meanwhile, Lazarus had no idea that Rutten had developed a serious relationship with a different woman. In May 1985, when Lazarus visited Rutten at his condo, she met his new girlfriend for the first time. The following month, she learned that he had proposed and the two were engaged. Her diary entry from that period said, "I really don't feel like working. I found out that John is getting married. My concentration is like -10. That night, she woke up her roommate in the middle of the night to talk about it. It was the only time he would later recall that he had ever seen her cry. In the days that followed, she visited Rutten's condo one final time before he moved in with his fiancée. Rutten cheated on Sherry with Lazarus one last time and would testify years later that the encounter was intended to give her closure. He never told his fiancée about this encounter. In August 1985, Lazarus wrote the following to Rutten's mother. "I'm truly in love with John, and the past year has really torn me up. I wish it didn't end the way it did, and I don't think I'll ever understand his decision." Around this same period, she was playing for an LAPD women's basketball team at the California Police Olympics. She told a teammate about a boyfriend from UCLA named John. The relationship in her mind was still ongoing. Shortly after writing that letter, Lazarus drove to Glendale Adventist Medical Center, where Sherry worked as a nursing director, and went directly to her office. She told Sherry that she and John were still seeing each other. She added that when their marriage eventually fell apart, she would be available to pick up the pieces. She ended the interaction by saying, "If I can't have John, no one else will, including you." After the wedding in November 1985, the couple installed a burglar alarm in their condo. Around this time, Lazarus began to date other men, which suggested she might be adjusting and moving on with her life. However, she continued to occasionally lurk around Rutten's condo while in uniform. Sometimes she'd even stop by when she knew Rutten was gone and Sherry was all alone. On one occasion, Sherry actually stumbled upon Lazarus in full uniform, standing in her living room after Rutten had left for the day. Sherry asked her to leave and did not report the incident to law enforcement, believing that little would have been done anyway since Lazarus was an officer. But she did inform her father of the situation after visiting her parents in Tucson. She told him that she feared Lazarus was stalking her, citing times when she would disguise herself as a young man and follow her in public. On February 23, 1986, a friend of Rutten's from UCLA visited the couple's home for the evening. Unlike their usual habit of entering through the garage, the front door was used during that visit, and Rutten inadvertently left it unlocked when the friend left. The next morning, Sherry had been scheduled to deliver a motivational presentation at Glendale Adventist Medical Center that day. The previous day, she had injured her back during an aerobics class, and she mentioned to Rutten before he left that morning that she might call in sick. She was still in bed when he said goodbye. Rutten left the residence at approximately 7:20 a.m. He made a few stops on his way to work and arrived at Micropolis, the hard drive manufacturer in Chatsworth where he was employed as an engineer, approximately 30 minutes later. As mentioned, the front door had been left unlocked the previous night. Lazarus was off duty that day and decided to stop by the couple's home once more through the front door, this time with the sole intention of killing Sherry. The struggle began with Lazarus grabbing a porcelain vase and breaking it over Sherry's head. Evidence also suggested that she had been pistol whipped twice with the barrel of a gun pressed forcefully against her face. The autopsy documented 15 separate injuries to her face alone. 2 of her fingernails had been completely ripped off during the struggle and were later found near the front door. At some point during the attack, Lazarus attempted to bind her with a thin rope but failed. The fight moved throughout the condo, and evidence suggested it began upstairs and continued downstairs. A bloody handprint was also found on the wall directly beside the burglar alarm's panic button. At some point during the attack, Sherry was bitten on her inner left forearm. This bite mark and the saliva left behind would become the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. In the end, Lazarus killed Sherry by firing 3 shots from her gun into her chest. The weapon was fired through a quilted blanket to muffle the sound. A maid in the neighboring unit later informed investigators that she heard screams but never heard any gunshots. The maid had thought it was just an argument and therefore did not call the police. Sherry died at the age of 29. After the shooting, Lazarus staged the scene. A stack of stereo equipment and a VCR was assembled at the base of the stairs near the front door, positioned as though a burglar had been in the process of loading up valuables before being interrupted. This particular detail would actually become a key component in unraveling the case. A thumb-shaped bloodstain sat on top of the record player in the stack. There was no usable fingerprint, which meant whoever left the stain was wearing gloves when they placed the equipment there. The blood itself was determined to belong to Sherry. Both Sherry's purse and BMW were taken while her jewelry box was untouched, creating pushback on the burglar theory. At 9:45 a.m. that same morning, a neighbor noticed that Rutten's garage door was open with no car, which was unusual for the area. Approximately 15 minutes later, Rutten made the first of several unanswered phone calls home throughout the course of the day. He found it strange that the answering machine was not picking up, because both he and Sherry always turned it on when they left home. Sherry's sister, a nurse at another local hospital, also called during the day and received no answer. When Rutten arrived home in the evening after work, he noticed broken glass on the driveway and realized immediately that Sherry's BMW was missing. Upon stepping inside the home, he found Sherry's lifeless body on the living room floor. LAPD homicide detective Lyle Mayer was the lead detective assigned to the case and arrived at the scene shortly after Rutten called police. That same night, he conducted his first interview with a devastated, barely coherent Rutten in the interrogation room. Rutten was weeping and in shock. He denied any involvement in his wife's death and agreed to undergo a polygraph test. The results came back inconclusive, which Mayer attributed entirely to the emotional state of a grieving man rather than evasion. After the initial investigation, Mayer informed Rutten that he believed that his home was burglarized and they were unaware that Sherry was still home. A few weeks later, another burglary in the same neighborhood seemed to provide additional corroboration. A woman returning home surprised the 2 intruders and found one of them was armed. To Mayer, this all but confirmed his theory. He even suspected that these same intruders could have been the ones who murdered Sherry. On March 7th, less than 2 weeks after the murder, a patrol officer spotted Sherry's BMW parked on the street about 2 miles from Rutten's home. The car itself was unlocked and the keys were still in the ignition. Inside were bloodstains, fiber evidence, and 4 unidentified fingerprints. Then in April, a man was arrested after being caught burglarizing a nearby residence where a stereo had been taken. Mayer considered him his primary suspect in Sherry's case. The man's fingerprints were compared against the 4 prints found inside the BMW, which led to him being ruled out. Mayer's partner, Detective Steve Hooks, was not as convinced with the burglary idea. From the beginning, Hooks flagged the bite mark on Sherry's arm as a strange occurrence for a burglary. He noted that bite marks inflicted during violent physical confrontations are far more commonly inflicted by women than by men, while the vast majority of residential burglars are male. Since the burglary theory already had momentum, the observation was effectively set aside. It was also brought up that the alleged burglary would have occurred in the daytime within a gated community, which would have carried significantly more risk of being discovered. To Hooks, it just didn't seem plausible. Not to mention, the scene within the condo seemed much more like a dragged-out fight. Burglars likely would have prioritized escape over going out of their way to fight and ultimately kill someone. Interestingly, the possibility of a jealous lover was introduced relatively early in the investigation. During Rutten's second interview, investigators asked if he was seeing other women outside of his wife. Rutten acknowledged that there was potentially someone, but did not reveal the full extent of his relationship with Lazarus. He simply provided them with her name. Sherry's parents, Nels and Loretta, were far more direct. They went to Mayer explicitly and told him about Lazarus. They described her as an obsessive ex-girlfriend who went to Sherry's place of work and threatened her life. But Mayer ultimately dismissed their concerns, saying that there was nothing there. There are no records of any contact with Lazarus or any attempt to investigate her in connection with the murder during the original investigation. Mayer later denied that Nels had ever directly asked him to look into Lazarus as a suspect. Rutten's own silence was also a controversial aspect in the case. Many believe that this was primarily fueled by a combination of guilt, shame, and possibly even genuine belief that Lazarus was not capable of murder. By mid-1986, the case had effectively stalled. For more than 20 years, Sherry's family fought to keep the case alive while the LAPD consistently shut them down. In 1987, Nels announced a reward and wrote directly to LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, naming Stephanie Lazarus as a suspect. Detectives responded by telling him he was watching too many movies and TV. In 1988, Sherry's sister suggested that true crime author Anne Rule write a book about the case. Nels told Rule about the Lazarus theory, and she said she would have a retired LAPD detective she used for research look into it. Days later, Rule reported back that the detective had told her the case was, quote, too hot to handle, and she declined to write about it. In 1989, Rutten briefly reconnected with Lazarus during a Hawaii vacation. He would later call Mayer to ask whether detectives were absolutely certain there was no evidence connecting Lazarus to his wife's death. And as far as he knew, Lazarus was truly not involved. In 1993, Nels offered to pay out of pocket for the DNA testing on the evidence, a new technology that had become available since the murder. He was told that the LAPD required an identified suspect before proceeding with testing. That same year, records show detectives briefly renewed interest in the case, but nothing came of it. In 1994, Lazarus was promoted to full detective. She also served a stint in the LAPD's Internal Affairs Division. By the end of the decade, she had started a private investigation firm, gotten married to a fellow officer she met while teaching a class in Oregon, and adopted a daughter. Then in 2001, Detective Cliff Shepard was working cold cases and turned his attention to Sherry's file. He noted that a bite mark swab had been collected from her forearm, and he requested that it be sent for DNA testing, and the results stated the DNA was from an unknown female. Before he could investigate further, he was taken off the case to serve on a task force dedicated to tracking down an active serial killer in the LA area. This test result was revisited 3 years later when Jennifer Francis was assigned to the cold case unit. She was given full access to every file on the case, and she immediately noticed something wrong. Several of the physical materials collected at the scene, which could have contained the culprit's DNA, were simply missing from the property log. Francis moved on and began testing Sherry's blood. She discovered that Sherry had a rare blood subtype. Previous testing had inaccurately suggested that there were 2 separate blood sources at the scene. This contributed to the theory that there was more than one assailant. But with this new finding, the two-attacker assumption had been more or less eliminated. She then turned to the bite mark swab, which Shepard had tested years prior, but she realized that it was not logged in the property system's database. The next step was to contact the county coroner's office where items collected during autopsies were typically stored. Frances was told that the swab was missing from their records as well. Luckily, she was able to get into contact with the original investigators who collected the swab back in 1986. He told Frances that the original swab itself was placed in a laboratory freezer that Frances could go retrieve herself. Subsequent testing of the swab against the DNA index system provided no matches, meaning that the culprit was not a known criminal. The physical violence, prolonged struggle, deliberate staging of the scene, and now a bite mark from a woman all pointed toward a single assailant with a personal motive. Frances turned back to the case file to look for context and came across a reference to a third-party female who had allegedly harassed the victim before the murder. The recorded information itself was vague. Frances initially interpreted it as potentially referring to a nurse at Glendale Adventist who had been passed over for a promotion and held a grudge against Sherry. She brought her findings and her interpretation to the supervising detective she was working with and asked him if the woman in question had ever been investigated. The detective said, "Oh, you mean the LAPD detective?" Up to that point, Frances had not been aware that the third party referenced in the file was a police officer. The detective elaborated, stating that the woman was a former girlfriend of the victim's husband and was later eliminated from their list of suspects. He then reiterated the department's long-standing position on the case being a burglary gone wrong. Frances later described this interaction as the moment she knew the investigation was being deliberately suppressed. The swab went back into storage and no additional time or resources was allocated to the development. Rather than simply accepting this, Frances continued pushing her findings through internal channels, eventually disclosing what she knew to the district attorney's office. According to her later whistleblower lawsuit, this is precisely when the retaliation began. This came in the form of forced counseling sessions, unwanted transfers, and a persistent pattern of harassment from within the department. She lost that lawsuit in 2019, but the underlying facts were never disputed. The updated case file sat with no assigned detective, but in March 2008, Van Nuys homicide detective Jim Nuttall arrived at his desk one morning to find a cardboard box sitting on the floor nearby. Inside were two cold case files that had been pulled for potential review. One of them was Sherry's. Jim and Barba spent the early part of their investigation rebuilding the physical case from the ground up, treating the scene as a premeditated killing rather than a burglary. Armed with this new perspective, they began building a list of potential female suspects with a plausible connection to the case. They contacted John Rutten, now remarried. He was asked to walk them through anyone who might have had reason to harm his first wife. When Rutten mentioned Lazarus, Jim asked whether she was still in the area, to which he said yes. From that moment forward, the two detectives ran the investigation under a strict code of secrecy. They worked the case behind closed doors and after hours. When they needed to pull personnel records for an officer from 20 years prior, they developed cover stories to explain the request without revealing what the records were actually for. Before they could test Lazarus's DNA, they worked through 4 other suspects. They eliminated each of them one by one through covertly collected DNA samples. The last of the 4 to be eliminated was the disgruntled nurse that Frances had originally identified as a possibility in 2004. When her DNA came back negative, only Lazarus remained. In order to progress the case, the duo needed to obtain a discarded DNA sample from Lazarus. So they began to observe her off-duty routine. This culminated in a discarded drink cup from Costco where she was shopping. Jim and Barba extracted the saliva from the cup's rim and sent it for a comparison to the bite swab, and the results came back as a match. With the confirmation, Jim and Barba could no longer keep the investigation entirely to themselves. The case was escalated to their supervisor, Rob Bubb, who began briefing department leadership. The information moved upward through senior officers all the way to LAPD Chief William Bratton and senior prosecutors from the district attorney's office. Given the nature of the case, the decision was made to transfer the investigation to the Robbery Homicide Division, the LAPD's elite unit that handles the department's most sensitive and high-profile cases. 2 detectives from RHD were selected to conduct the arrest and questioning. Their names were Greg Stearns and Dan Jaramillo. On the morning of June 5th, 2009, the 2 detectives called Lazarus at her desk in the art theft unit, which was located at Parker Center, down the hall from the robbery homicide division that was now preparing to arrest her. They told her they had someone in custody who wanted to speak with her about an art theft matter. She agreed to come down. Upon entering Parker Center, she surrendered her service weapon and equipment belt as required. What followed was an intense and careful conversation with a killer who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. They explained quickly and gently that this was not actually about an art theft. Her name had come up in a case file that they had been reviewing, they said. It was an old case involving someone named John Rutten. They wanted to speak to her privately as to not fuel the office rumor mill. They mentioned specifically that she was now married to someone else and they were simply being discreet. Lazarus played along, acknowledging that she knew Rutten and said, "God, that's been a million years ago." As the conversation continued, Greg and Dan began probing her knowledge of Sherry. Lazarus's initial response was strategically vague, stating that she may have met her, but couldn't recall specific details. The more the detective steered her towards Sherry specifically, the more her answers began to accumulate small inconsistencies. She said she couldn't remember the wife's name, then half recalled it as something like Shelley. Lazarus also later changed her statement about not meeting her to acknowledging that the 2 encountered each other a couple of times at a hospital. When asked how she had heard about Sherry's death, Lazarus said she thought she may have seen a flyer at work and had probably called the family. She remembered she said faintly that it might have involved a burglary. She mentioned that Rutten had maybe said something about illegal substances being involved. Rutten later confirmed that he had said no such thing. The most revealing moment came when Lazarus began offering a story about why she might have visited Sherry at the hospital. She constructed a narrative in which Rutten had been calling her repeatedly even after beginning his relationship with Sherry, and she had decided to go tell Sherry directly to get Rutten to stop calling her. She was quoted saying, "I'm thinking that I may have gone to her and said, 'Hey, is this guy dating you? Because he's bothering me. And so I'm thinking that we had a conversation about that. 1 or 2 maybe. You know, it could have been 3. She added that the conversation was very casual and never got heated. She then attempted to revise the hospital visit into something even more neutral, suggesting maybe she had stopped by on her way to work in Hollywood, but the damage was done. As the investigators continued pressing, Lazarus became visibly more cautious, asking, "I mean, what's this all about? I mean, I don't have anything to do with it. And you got something that somebody said, whatever." She acknowledged having been assigned to the Van Nuys division twice in the 1990s. She mentioned with apparent confidence that she had probably spoken to a detective about Sherry's case at some point. She seemed unaware or was feigning ignorance of the significance of having confirmed her own access to the Van Nuys division files during the years when investigators would later determine the files had been partially stripped of key evidence. Eventually, the detectives asked directly whether she had ever had a fight with Sherry. She paused and then said, "I mean, they're saying, okay, I fought with her, so I must have killed her. I mean, come on." At that point, no one in the room had accused her. The accusation had come from inside her own mind. When Lazarus was finally asked if she would be willing to provide DNA for comparison purposes, she crumbled. She mentioned how she might be open to it, but that she would need to speak to someone first. Additionally, Lazarus began demanding to see the evidence that they had on her before the conversation continued. She said, "This is absolutely crazy. I want to see stuff. This is insane. Am I on candid camera or something? This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy." From there, she stood up and walked out of the room, but immediately after stepping foot into the hallway, she was arrested. At the moment Lazarus was being handcuffed, another team began executing the search warrant on her home and vehicle. Inside the house, investigators found her multiple volumes of her diary, filled with entries documenting her love for John Rutten, her desolation upon learning of his engagement to Sherry, and her anguish at the wedding that she believed had stolen the future she was owed. Over the next 3 years, Lazarus's defense attorney, Mark Overland, filed multiple motions to have the case dismissed or evidence suppressed. He stated that the 23-year-old evidence was too stale to allow a fair defense, and that her statements during the Parker Center interview had been made under compulsion. Overland also attempted to argue that the DNA testing used was unproven technology. Judge Robert Perry denied all motions. The trial began in early February 2012. During the trial, Rutten wept on the stand as he recounted the details of his relationship with Lazarus, calling his final romantic encounter with her a mistake he deeply regretted. The jury deliberated for 7 days before returning a guilty verdict. Later that month, Judge Perry sentenced Lazarus to 27 years to life in state prison. She was transported to the California Institution for Women in Corona, where she remains incarcerated. From 2013 to 2015, multiple appeals were filed, but ultimately all turned down. Under a newer California law granting special parole consideration to offenders who committed their crimes before age 26, Lazarus applied for early parole in 2023, having been 25 at the time of the murder. It was at this hearing, after more than 3 decades of denying any involvement, that Lazarus finally confessed. She stated, "I will never ever harm an individual like I did on February 24th, 1986, when I callously and heinously murdered Sherry Rasmussen." She described the killing as stemming from an argument that became physical, but prosecutors and investigators pushed back, pointing to evidence that the attack had been planned and deliberate, not spontaneous. The parole panel initially voted to grant her release, influenced partly by extensive testimony from former fellow inmates and advocates who described Lazarus's helpfulness in prison. Rutten appeared before the board, calling Lazarus a master of deception who had lied for decades until parole was her only remaining option. Greg Stearns, the detective who had arrested Lazarus in 2009, testified that her actions were not those of a youthful offender. They were those of a mature and sophisticated criminal who had used her law enforcement training to commit and conceal a murder. Governor Gavin Newsom ordered the parole board's decision reviewed, citing concerns about Lazarus's years of evasion and the calculated nature of the crime. The full board reversed the grant and rescinded parole in late 2024. In early 2025, a second parole request was denied. As of 2026, Stephanie Lazarus remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona and is next eligible for parole consideration in 2028.